I would have at least some respect for American attitude if it wasn't so hypocritical. And I say hypocritical because Americans remember their supposed love for the freedom of speech only when it suits them. When we're discussing neo-Nazism in Europe, then Americans are suddenly all about freedom of speech. But when we discuss LGBT movement, for example, then Americans are against freedom of speech. Then they want to crucify anybody who speaks against, who voice any argument against the LGBT movement. So yeah, Americans are pretty hypocritical, but at the very least, Americans had very little personal experience, direct experience with Nazism. Nazism was more or less a European affair as far as, at least as a political movement. I mean, yeah, there were some American industrialists that supported, that funded and financially supported Hitler, but America generally had very little to do with Nazism. After all, I mean, Americans played contrary to what Hollywood propaganda would like you to believe. Americans had very little to do with the defeat of Nazism. It weren't American troops that entered Berlin in 1945. Those were Soviet troops, the Red Army. Soviet Union was the force that defeated Nazi Germany. And that is one of the main reasons why I respect and support modern Russia as much as I do. Because whatever you think of Russia's political moves and political decisions, at the very least, Russia acts and thinks and behaves in accordance with its own experience. Unlike America, Russia had huge, horrific experience with Nazi Germany. It's possibly the most horrific experience in the history of humankind. So it is understandable that Russia would support such a resolution. Ukraine is sadly the opposite example. There are many countries, especially throughout Eastern Europe, which act and behave and vote against their own historical experience. Just 70 plus years ago, Ukrainians were suffering greatly under the Nazism. And we can see now that modern Ukraine is voting practically in favor of neo-Nazism. I have to say that I tried to and failed to find out how did Serbia vote this time around. I know that in the past, Serbia voted in favor of such resolutions, for example in 2014, but I'm not sure about this time around. What is actually disturbing is that not even Sputnik Serbia reported how did Serbia vote this time around. I'm afraid that Serbia might have been abstained in this vote on November 18th, which is a little shameful because I see no reason why Serbia would abstain, why Serbia wouldn't support such a resolution. Because of that, many will probably repeat the lie that Serbian public and Serbian society is promoting neo-Nazism, which is a pure propaganda lie. What is happening in Serbia is, finding out the historical truth. We here in Serbia, we are talking openly about Draža Mihajlović and his movement, not because he was a Nazi collaborator, but quite the opposite, because he was not. Draža Mihajlović, which is now a historical fact, was actually fighting against the Nazis. Throughout the war, Draža Mihajlović had an active correspondence with Moscow. He had an officer, Dragiša Vasić, who was actually liaison officer with Moscow during the entire war. So yeah, Draža Mihajlović was fighting against Nazis. I'm saying this because depending on how Serbia voted, some will probably try to make propaganda lies about Serbia. Just to be clear, Serbia is not promoting neo-Nazism. Sadly, Serbian leadership may very well might have chosen to abstain from this vote, but it doesn't speak of Serbian society. Serbians as a nation are, by and large, in huge majority of Serbs actually support Russia and on this matter too. Me personally, I'm thankful to Russia for fighting Nazism, just like Russia fought against Nazism in 1941 to 1945. The same way Russia is fighting the modern Nazism and neo-Nazism. That is why Russia deserves our full support.